Cynthia Arnson is director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program. She joins us today to discuss the latest from Venezuela. Cindy, welcome to Now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So give us a status update. Are things getting better, getting worse, staying about the same?
Well, I think they're staying about the same. I mean, the protesters have been violently sort of dislodged from the main area in Caracas, the capital, where they were demonstrating. But there are really demonstrations that continue all over the country. And the government, on the one hand, has been calling for a dialogue, and at the same time sending troops out and sending paramilitary groups, which it claims not to control, to violently attack the student protesters. And so it's and there's been violence on the other side as well. And I think the risk of ongoing escalation is quite substantial.
About that, the words don't match the actions. The president's, if you just took a transcript of some of President Maduro's statements, you would think that there's a strong relationship with the protesters, that it's a positive relationship, but then you look at the actual actions, it says something different. What's going on there?
Well, there are a lot of different messages. I mean, on the one hand, the president is calling the protesters fascists and criminals, and at the same time trying to convene a dialogue, which is pretty much a fake dialogue. The only opposition people that have entered that now are from the private sector, because they all recognize the economy has to get
Fake because
back.
he's insincere, or fake because the opposition doesn't want to meet with him?
Well, because the opposition is demanding as a condition of sitting down that people who have been arrested during these protests, scores of people remain in jail, that human rights violations stop. They're demanding some conditions for there to be a dialogue with the people who are really in opposition, not the student groups that are more or less in favor of the government. So there is the sort of discourse of calling for dialogue, at the same time a very heavy hand.
When the president takes that more conciliatory approach with his rhetoric, is that for the world community? Who's the audience for that?
Well, I think it's both for Venezuela and for the international community to show that the government is interested, in a dialogue and is not just looking for a violent solution to these protests. But the fact is that the opposition is not willing to sit down with him under the conditions that exist in the country, which include lots of people in jail, credible reports of mistreatment and even torture in confinement in prison, and ongoing brutality on the part of government troops.
And speaking of the international community, we see things like this week, Air Canada suspending flights. Will we see more actions like this?
Well, that's mostly, I think, because of the economic crisis and the lack of convertibility between the dollar and the Venezuelan currency, the bolivar. And I think that, but I doubt that there will be sanctions. In fact, I'm really kind of doubtful that sanctions, particularly by the United States, are going to help very much, because the more that President Maduro can blame what's happening inside the country on foreign plots and foreign imperialism, it's going to make it that much more difficult to resolve the crisis.
Take us back to the beginnings of these protests. Have the reasons that people were protesting evolved, or what are still the core complaints?
Well, the core complaints had to do with the levels of insecurity in the country. The crime and violence is the highest of any other country in South America, and also the economy. The inflation is probably one of the second or third worst in the entire world, close to 60% annual inflation. These are figures that even the Central Bank of Venezuela will admit. There are widespread scarcities, cuts of electricity and water. Those things are not going to go away. And to really resolve these underlying problems is going to, I think, involve overcoming some of the polarization and the sharp polarization that exists in the country.
Is this government responsible for these conditions, or is this something that Venezuela was headed to no matter what happened? If Hugo Chavez were still alive, is this something that was in the cards?
Well, I think it's certainly worsened since Hugo Chavez died and President Maduro was elected in 2013. But all of the seeds of this crisis, the inefficiency in the oil industry, the lack of attention to infrastructure, the shortages, the attacks on private and foreign capital, the excessive government spending for electoral purposes in 2012, in particular before the presidential election, all of these things have led to the acuteness of the crisis, but it's been building now for many years.
Is there a way out?
Well, it's very difficult to see it now. There's a possibility that an organization like the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, will be able to put together a credible and balanced group of foreign ministers. There was a meeting last week in Santiago, Chile during the inauguration of President Bachelet, and there's the expectation that there will be a delegation that will go to Venezuela in early April. But whether it will be a credible group or whether it will be weighted to one side, I think is anyone's guess. UNASUR itself is very divided.
And Cynthia, I wouldn't ask you to guess. I know you wouldn't want to do that. But just for a final thought, what do you expect next? Is there going to be progress toward a resolution, or is this going to become somewhat chronic?
I think it's going to become chronic. I think the underlying problems are not going to go away. They're only going to worsen. There's going to be continued devaluations. And the student protests, the more people, are attacked, the more people in jail, the more people that are killed on both sides, I think the more radicalized the movement becomes. And that is a danger, because right now the majority of the student protesters are peaceful, but that could very quickly change.
Well, thank you. It's a tense situation, and we hope to speak with you about it again.
Thanks.